All right, everybody, we're back. So hopefully you got a chance to reflect a little bit on our Padlet. Now we're going to look at the guidelines for Universal Design for Learning. Now these guidelines are really helpful in thinking through and creating a design lens that you apply to whatever context that you find yourself teaching in, right? So I've used these to help design lessons for kids in TK. I've used these for help in me designing lessons for a college class and in everywhere between. So the real piece to this is to just start practicing. Now you'll notice each one of these guidelines, right? So these big kind of principles here related to Universal Design for Learning has these guidelines and checkpoints. So the guidelines here are here in the colored sections, and then the checkpoints are here in the that have the numbers connected to them. Now this is an older version of the UDL guidelines. The language has stayed the same throughout all the versions, just you'll see these different ways that they're laid out. And so this is one that we're just going to jump in today, but it is an older version. Now the one thing you'll want to know or connect with as you're looking at these from a broad landscape is seeing that this first row here is a row that's great for you to start. So if you're just wanting to like dabble and experiment as a teacher, these are things that you can do as a teacher right away to design into your instruction. Now notice, it doesn't tell you exactly what to do. It tells you, gives you an idea of where you want to go, what you want to think about. The strategies you won't necessarily find here in the checkpoints. You have to come up with those on your own, because like choice in TK is going to look very different than choice in Fresno State college class, right? And so rather than give you strategies, we need you to know that choice is really, really important within your instruction. It's up to you to think through how you design and implement choice. Varying the methods for response and navigation for a kid in kindergarten, that might look like them bringing up blocks to their teacher. For a kid in 8th grade, like algebra, that might look very, very different. And so again, the value stays the same. It's how that value plays its way out is where you get to design towards. Now moving down a row, now we're thinking about the ways you're designing with the kid next to you or with the kid in mind, right? So now we're thinking about, well, how do I facilitate the kid working in teams, or getting a chance to hear feedback from me? How do I get the kids starting to work through how to design and make choices? How do I support vocabulary development until finally we get to this final row that's where it's more and more, this is facilitated by you and the kid is doing the majority of the work and the design, right? So the kid is able to see the big ideas that connect concepts together. The kid is able to goal set and develop strategy, develop setbacks, or sorry, plans of action when they experience setbacks. And then over here in 9, how is the kids able to cope when things don't go their way, or self-assess to determine if they should be coping or not? So that's the big layout. Now we're going to start looking at each individual principle, starting with engagement, and try to unpack what those things are. So in thinking about engagement, we need to understand that UDL is all about thinking through how the brain operates. So your brain has a bunch of different networks, and they've highlighted the big networks around learning. And the first network that we're looking at is the affective network. It's inside your brain. That's why this brain picture is kind of split. And it's connected right near your brainstem. It's super, super important part of your brain, right? If this part of your brain gets injured, you're pretty much done. And so this is the part of your brain that assigns value, worth, tells you whether or not it's something you actually love or that is worth your time. You're using your affective part of your brain right now as you're listening to this online, because you're trying to determine, is this something I buy into, or is this something that's not worth my time? Hopefully you're buying into it. I don't have control over that because your brain is assigning the value. But to prove my point, think about the things you really, really love. Maybe it's your profession. Maybe it's your family. Maybe it's your church or your God. Maybe it's like success or acclaim. Maybe it's money. and the power associated with it. Maybe it's some sort of sport or leisure. Maybe it's competition. Maybe it's just getting outside and enjoying a nice day at the beach. Now, think of the amount of time and energy you're willing to put into those things, right? For the most part, like if you think especially of educators, like this is our world. In some facet of this, these are the places that we're spending most of our energy and mental pursuits. That is because we've assigned value to them and we know that they're important to us. They're things that we're willing to make sacrifices for. Our kids are the same way. They have things that are on their list that they value, that they love, that they see as really, really important. Now, the key is those things might not necessarily be our things. Great instruction connects what we're trying to teach to the kids' things that they love, showing that academics actually play their way out in a kid's life. Here's looking at it another way. So here's a story. I was teaching sight words to a group of kids. So I used to be a special day class teacher. And I was having a real hard time getting kids to even be motivated to try to learn some sight words, much less read them within the context of a sentence. So first and foremost, I wanted to get them hooked because nothing was working except I knew that there was a group of boys who loved playing video games, specifically fighting video games. This is old school, like this is my style, but think power levels. So I had the idea, let's put out cards, and if they got it right, if they read the word correctly, then my power level would go down and I'd race a little on a board. If they got it wrong, they missed the word, then their power level would go down. Just that little tweak, me writing with a whiteboard marker on the table 2 bars and then with my finger erasing the bars, depending on what happened, changed everything about sight words. Suddenly, like, sight words were their favorite time within that group. And it wasn't just the boys, it was also the girls. Everybody, because it was connected to a context that they were interested in or had some fun experience with, now all of a sudden they were at least hooked to want to delve into the world of sight words. And so that's a silly story, I know, but still a story that shows what this could look like in action if we're thinking about how to connect what we're teaching to relevant things our kids care about. The affective network of our brains, and this is coming from CAST, Center for Applied Special Technology. I did not think of UDL. I am not nearly that gifted or connected to all of the research. The CAST folks did, and they're wonderful. So if you go to cast.org, they will hook you up with a lot of free stuff and help you get down the road for designing with universal design for learning in mind. But I love this picture from them. This is a picture of a series of glass shelves. And the idea here is the affective network is holding up the other networks. So if that breaks, if a kid doesn't see why something matters, or if we're not able to make the stuff that we're trying to teach relevant to our kids, it doesn't matter how well we represent it. It doesn't matter how many choices we give or how many options we get for the kids get for goal setting or measuring their own progress, because they think that it doesn't matter. And so it will not hold up. That's why representation is so important. Take a minute and discuss this with someone next to you if you're sitting with someone, or talk about it on our Padlet and think through these 2 questions. Take a minute and discuss the stories that the learners you serve are living in. What are the things that they'd be interested in, and how could you connect what you're teaching to those things? Have a quick conversation, write about it in our Padlet. Awesome. We're going to pretend like you did that, even though I know some of you didn't, and I forgive you for it. Now, let's go ahead and move to another principle. The next principle, well, technically it is a network too, because we're going to look at a network of a brain, is around recognition, and it's the representation network of our brains. So our brains like to have things represented in different ways so that we can connect as many concepts together as we can. That's why we love things like stories. We love analogies. We love songs that tell us history. We love seen or watching movies, right? That tell us stories that we might have read 1,000 times in a book or seen a bunch of times growing up, but we love the movie version because it's a new way to see a story. That's a quick version of representation. And it's something that we as teachers are doing all the time in kids' brains. I don't know if you know that, but we're constantly doing little brain surgeries on kids by how we teach them and how we represent material. A story that came out of CAST that I really liked for this, showing the power of representation and engagement connected together by showing what happens when they disconnect. So there is a syndrome, there's a delusion called Capgras delusion. And in this, someone gets a bump on the head and there's a disconnect that happens in their brain where loved ones that they have, think like a pet or a specific person, a lot of times it's a spouse, where they will see that person after this injury and not recognize them, even though they look the same, even though they smell the same, even though that like they have the same mannerisms, even though like nothing about that person has changed. They'll say that is an imposter. That is someone that's a spy. They'll say all these random crazy things, and it's a real deal thing. I have that linked here if you want to learn more about it. The reason for this, they came to discover, is that that person doesn't feel the same. That's about, like, think back to the glass shelves analogy. That's how powerful engagement is, in that all the evidence in front of this person says, hey, yo, this is your wife, or yo, this is your Cocker Spaniel. And still that person will say, like, that's not my wife. That's not my dog, because they don't feel the same way they felt before. And all sorts of terrible stories have happened. If you look at it, it's worth going into the YouTube rabbit hole. But don't do it. Don't do it now. Stay with me. So Capgras delusion is an example of this. Now let's talk about it in form of something as simple as an apple. If I first wanted to teach you an apple, the best way, in my opinion, would be just to throw an apple at you and say, like, this is delicious, take a bite. If I wanted to show you what that looked like in a more pictorial form, I would show you a picture of an apple. I also, if I need you to jump and not just see that, you know, what I threw you was an apple or this picture was an apple. This actually is represented with symbols, with words. Here's a picture with the words, so that eventually, no matter what type of representation of apple you get, you still know what that concept is. You still, in your mind's eye, can picture what that bite would sound like, or can picture places and spaces where you'll see, or you could understand the usefulness of apples. And so there are all sorts of different representations of apple. And we could even take this further and say, well, apple pie. We could take it applesauce. Apple can, when you pull it apart, can actually be a really, really wide concept. And the more you know about an apple, the more you know about the different representations of an apple, the more delicious recipes you're able to make, and the more overall concepts that you can connect an apple to. That's representation. So the last area that we want to focus on is the principle of action and expression. So if this is what the teacher's doing to represent concepts so that kids understand it, this is what the kids are doing to show their understanding of concepts and to meet their own goals. So this is thinking about the frontal kind of lobe of our brains. It's there. It's around like your executive functioning of your brains. And here is a fun story that represents this whole idea of what happens when your frontal lobe, when the front of your brain gets injured. So spend a minute. There's way more out there on the internet than what I can describe, but do a little search on this guy named Phineas Gage and see if you can figure out why he's an example of action and expression, right? This specific part of someone's brain and what that part of the brain does. So give you a minute, do a little search, have a little fun, pause the video, and then we'll come back. So I'm going to assume again that you did it. I know some of you didn't, so I'm going to tell you about him. He was a railway worker, and he was packing some explosive powder, and he forgot to pack sand on top. And so when he did went to temp it down with a rod, the actual powder exploded and launched the rod clear through his frontal lobe of his brain. And it totally messed with how he made choices, messed with his personality, messed with all sorts of all of the ways that he was Phineas. My favorite, the doctor talked about finding teacup sized portions of his brain on the railway car. So it was crazy, nasty. But the interesting thing is all the choices that he was able to make, his ability to think and strategize radically changed as a result of obviously a rod going through that portion of his brain. So that's the part of the brain that we're trying to mess with or trying to work with, not in a bad way, but in a good way, when we're giving kids options, letting them think and wrestle through their understanding and express their understanding of concepts. And so those are the UDL guidelines. They go from, in this representation, top to bottom, and other representations from bottom to top, depending on what you look at. So pay attention to the language. So we use these then to design towards instruction. So we use these for the building. All right, take a minute and describe your initial reactions to what we've talked about as we look through the UDL guidelines. And we'll come back and talk through how to design lessons with UDL in mind.